There has been a great deal of discussion of late about development, affordable housing, and population growth in our county and in our cities. I thought it would be useful to talk about how development review works in Alachua County. To discuss these topics, I'm glad to welcome Jeffrey Hayes, the Acting Growth Management Director of the Alachua County Growth Management Department. Jeff has been a resident of North Florida for most of his life, and he's been with Alachua County for 16 years. He's a graduate of the University of Florida with an educational background in environmental science and policy. Jeff has been employed by the United States Geological Service and Hernando and Alachua counties in a variety of environmental, land use, and transportation planning roles. Jeff is one of the authors of the Alachua County Mobility Plan, which seeks to effectively link land use and transportation through compact development patterns and multimodal transportation. The Mobility Plan was awarded a Planning Excellence Award in 2009 by the Department of Community Affairs and a 2012 Better Community Award by the Thousand Friends of Florida. Jeff has extensive experience in Florida growth management, and he has spoken to numerous groups and professional organizations regarding Alachua County's efforts to provide mixed-use, walkable, and bikeable communities which are accessible by transit. Thanks for joining me, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's just kind of launch right into, can you explain what a developer has to do to have a project approved in Alachua County?
So the first thing is, obviously, it has to do with jurisdiction. So Alachua County, each local government is in charge of approving development and land use within their jurisdiction. So in the unincorporated area, Alachua County and the Alachua County Board of County Commissioners are in charge of approving land use and development decisions. If you're inside the city limits of Gainesville or one of the other municipalities, it's that municipality that handles the development approval.
Now, I understand there is one caveat to that, and that comes to environmental protection.
Right. So Alachua County does have countywide stormwater regulations and countywide natural resources regulations. And so our environmental protection department does get involved in any natural resources or water quality issues countywide, even if it's in a municipality.
Does that include like protecting wetlands? Is that a countywide?
It does, yes. We have a countywide wetlands code, and so any kind of impacts to wetlands would be reviewed through our county environmental protection department.
I know we have kind of the big two documents that you certainly access when you're looking at developments. Tell us about those.
Right. So any development, in order for it to be approved by either the Board of County Commissioners or our Development Review Committee, and I can get into that detail a little bit here moving on. Mm-hmm. Any development has to be consistent with our comprehensive plan and our Unified Land Development Code, which are our land development regulations.
And I know we don't have 2 hours for this interview, but can you tell us kind of in a nutshell, what is the comp plan?
So the comprehensive plan of Alachua County, and every local government has a comprehensive plan. It's the broad policy framework. So it has lots of policies. There's different elements to the comprehensive plan. There's a future land use element. There's a transportation mobility element, there's a housing element, there's an energy element. There's many different elements that set up the broad policy framework for growth and development within the county.
And then the Unified Land Development Codes are kind of the partner to that.
Exactly. So the Unified Land Development Code is where you actually get into more specifics. So our zoning is a part of our Unified Land Development Code. Any sort of specific regulations on density and intensity, and how developments are actually designed, all the engineering requirements, those are all part of our land development code.
And these things are not just documents that are out there that counties give or get. These are things that are approved by the county commission, and I know there's an exhaustive process in updating them and keeping them current.
Right. So ultimately, these are the documents that belong to the Alachua County Board of County Commissioners. They set the policies in the comprehensive plan, and they set the regulations in our land development code. Any changes to those documents that are proposed, any revisions that are either proposed by maybe county staff or by an individual property owner, have to be reviewed by oftentimes the Planning Commission, which is our citizen board that reviews and makes recommendations, and then ultimately moves on to the Board of County Commissioners, who makes final determinations on those changes or revisions.
And cities have comp plans as well. Is that correct?
Yes, every jurisdiction in Florida, every local government has a comprehensive plan that any development, growth and development has to be consistent with.
All right, so let's say I've got a project. I want to start the process to have it reviewed? I come to growth management, or I do it online. What is the first step?
Yeah, typically we would have a pre-application conference with any property owner or developer who was looking to do a project, where we would go over what they were trying to do. And we just do a very cursory review of the comprehensive plan, making sure that the density or the intensity of the development is going to be consistent with that. We go through any issues. We sort of do a desktop review of our geographic information system, look for any environmental issues, transportation issues that would be specific to that piece of property. And then if it looks like it may be consistent with our plan and the Unified Land Development Code, the applicant then will actually submit an application. And the first step, we have a two-step development review process in Alachua County. We have a preliminary development plan, which is often sort of a bubble plan. It's not the detailed engineering drawings. It's more, the important thing for that plan is making sure the environmental resources are considered, the tree preservation areas are considered, any access points that are going to be to the transportation network, those are the things that are considered. And then ultimately that the density intensity of the development that's proposed is consistent with the comprehensive plan and the Unified Land Development Code.
So when you get past that bubble stage, they present a more kind of formal, detailed plan?
Exactly. So depending on the size of the development that's proposed, and as an example, anything over 25 units, actually it's the Board of County Commissioners who approves that preliminary development plan. After that is approved, then the applicant and the developer and the engineers will actually develop the detailed engineering drawings, which have things like the stormwater design, which have the detailed pavement design if they're building new roads, that kind of detail. And that goes to a final development plan, which is ultimately approved by our development review committee. But it's also through a public hearing process, so the public is invited to each of those steps in the process.
Now, I want to make sure I understand. It's a little confusing to me. So there is an automatic. If it's 25 units or more, then it's automatically going before the county commission. Is that correct?
Exactly. So the county commission set into our Unified Land Development Code that any project that was greater than 25 residential units would come to them for review so that they could be a part of that review.
And then it also goes to the development review committee?
Right. So
okay.
The idea being that once the sort of broad policy determinations and the big picture issues have been handled by the Board of County Commissioners, the detailed review and detailed design requirements go to our development review committee. It's reviewed by staff. So one important part of each of those steps is that we actually do a staff review and issue a staff report on the proposal to tell whoever the decision maker is, whether it's the Board of County Commissioners or the development review committee, that staff feels, and we're the experts in the Land Development Code and the Comprehensive Plan, that we feel that it's consistent with the Comprehensive Plan or the Land Development Code.
And this doesn't all happen at growth management. I mean, there are many departments and even departments outside of Alachua County's jurisdiction that are involved in development review. Can you list some of those?
That's correct. Yeah, that's a really important point. So we in growth management coordinate the review of the development, but of course we have many departments who have different expertise, both in the county and then other, as you mentioned, other agencies outside of the county. So for instance, inside the county, we have our Public Works department who looks at the engineering. We have our fire rescue and fire marshal who look at any sort of fire related issues. Mm-hmm. We have an environmental protection department that I mentioned that looks at the environmental issues. We have our local health department that looks at, especially when we have a development that may have septic tanks or other issues like that, our health department will look at it. And then oftentimes if they're connecting to, say, a state road, we'll send it to the Florida Department of Transportation just to make sure that they have any comments, and we'll send it to other outside agencies when it's appropriate.
I know the school board likes to chime in as well.
They do, yes. And we have an interlocal agreement with the school board, and we have school concurrency adopted. So whenever there's a development that's being approved that has new residential units, that automatically goes to the school board for a review and a statement back to the county on if there's available school capacity.
So we've got this back and forth. You know, you all provide a lot of advice and review. And then assuming that everything is in compliance with the comp plan and the codes, then a project is approved.
Right, and so one really important step to all of this, of course, is making sure the public is involved. So as part of that hearing process, we have a lot of advertising that's required, either published advertising You'll see our orange or yellow signs out in the community that we posted on a property that's proposed for development. And then we have some resources on our website that allow the public to come in and get information on what's being proposed. And then, of course, they can communicate back to us as staff with any particular concerns that they may have on the development. And then ultimately, each of these steps, as I mentioned, is a public hearing. And so those are available and open to the public to come. And if they have any comments or concerns, to come and actually speak to the decision makers directly on those comments or concerns to potentially have them addressed.
Do you look at the geography of a project and decide that there are certain people that are clearly stakeholders in terms of them being noticed about what's going on?
Right, exactly. So our land development code on most types of projects require us to contact people that are within, especially if it's over the threshold for the Board of County Commissioners, require us to contact people who are within a 500-foot boundary if you're in the urbanized area, and then within a quarter mile out in the rural area where there's larger properties.
So I think that's a pretty good summary of what happens as you're trying to follow the comp plan and the code. What happens when a project comes in and it's clear that it's not going to be consistent with the comp plan, or the zoning is not appropriate for what's being built, or it doesn't necessarily follow all of the details of the Unified Land Development Code? What happens then?
So there's a couple options. One, we would ultimately, when an applicant comes in and we see any of those issues, we would raise it with them, and sometimes that application doesn't go forward. If there are changes that the applicant or the property owner would like to propose, we do have, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to amend those documents, either the future land use map of our comprehensive plan, specific policies within our comprehensive plan. So what we'll do is we'll look at the issues, we'll let the applicant know and let them know, if it would require changes, and they can decide. We have a comprehensive plan amendment process. We have obviously the rezoning process that's available, and you can actually do a private amendment to our Unified Land Development Code. But in each of those instances, ultimately, the project or even the change to any of those documents has to be found consistent with the broad policy framework of the Alachua County Comprehensive Plan. So that's really important to keep in mind.
Jeff, as people kind of debate what can county commissioners or city commissioners or any governing body do in terms of approving or disapproving development, one of the things that I hear frequently is by right. There are certain rights that property owners have when it comes to development. So can you give us an idea of what by right is, and maybe address just what authority and power and discretion county commissioners have? Yeah,
and that's a great question. Certainly, all property owners have property rights that are associated with owning that property. A good way to think about it is the county commission, for instance, has the most discretion actually in setting up the property rights at their comprehensive plan stage. So that's when they set their future land use map and their broad policies. And that's a legislative decision. It has to be based on data and analysis, but the county commission has their most discretion there. As you move to the more specified steps of the development process, so you move to zoning, and then ultimately you move to development plan approval, what the Board of County Commissioners is doing in those cases is those hearings are quasi-judicial hearings. They sit as judges, and what they're doing is they're hearing the evidence, and it's got to be competent and substantial evidence to make the decision on if the proposed development, for instance, is consistent with the Land Development Code and the comprehensive plan. So at that point, property owners, if the density that's assigned to their development is consistent, if they meet all of the environmental regulations that are in the code, if they are preserving the trees that the code specifies has to be preserved, if they're making the transportation improvements that are specified by the Land Development Code, then they do have a right to have that development approved if they can meet all of the standards within the Unified Land Development Code and Comprehensive Plan.
I see. It's complicated.
It can be. Yep.
And there are another thing that I frequently hear about some developments is, why don't they just disapprove it? And this is not just at the county commission level, it's at the city levels And I think it's important for citizens, if they really want to understand this, to get involved in the process, come to the public hearings, talk to staff, um, and I know that you guys are very accessible and very willing to explain things. But let's talk a little bit about the impacts of development. I know another term that gets kind of thrown around a lot is concurrency and traffic congestion, but what are the impacts that you consider or that are considered and are part of these processes?
So about 10 years ago, both the state of Florida and Alachua County went away from a transportation concurrency model, which was looking at individual segments of roadway and looking at congestion on individual segments of roadway. The reason being that ultimately, if you deny a development, say, for instance, on a particular segment of roadway, but you approve a development farther out into the countryside because out there is capacity on that roadway, what we found is that the traffic still impacts all of the segments of the roadway. And especially in Gainesville and Alachua County, we have a strong commuting pattern into the heart of downtown, into the university, into Shands. So, you can't really get away from the traffic. So the idea is, as you grow and develop, to make sure that you have the infrastructure that's necessary. So what we do in Alachua County is we have a multimodal transportation mitigation program. So each new development actually pays a fee towards providing that new capacity. And so that what that funding goes to is new roads. So making connections, an example, some of the roads that have been constructed lately are the Southwest 8th Avenue extension out, in the Tioga area, and the connection over near the Linton Oaks area. Those are things that we use those, and they're basically impact fees, one-time fees that development pays. We use those to complete the roadway grid in the urbanized area.
Jeff, I know the urban cluster line, and that map is a very important part of this whole thing, and how it relates to what some call sprawl. Can you explain that to us?
So one of the keys to the county's comprehensive plan is our urban cluster boundary. And so that area, which goes out to approximately Jonesville on the west, and then Noonan's Lake on the east, and then a little bit to the north and south of Gainesville as well, that area is where we allow urban type densities and intensities, and where we allow the extension or the provision of water and sewer service to serve those developments. And we do not allow the extension of water and sewer, for instance, outside of that boundary. And the thought process being that we do want to preserve our agricultural lands, we do want to preserve portions of the county in a rural lifestyle, and of course we want to preserve our sensitive environmental resources, which are generally speaking outside of that boundary. So the urban cluster boundary, getting density, not allowing higher density outside of that, we actually push density closer together into the urban cluster area, and then we can start to provide things like transit service, like parks. We can provide more in a more fiscally efficient manner, fire rescue services and police services, sheriff services. So the idea about having uses and density closer together allows us to provide the services that the county provides in a more fiscally efficient manner.
And then, of course, because of the generosity of Alachua County voters, who 3 times have voted to tax themselves to purchase conservation lands, I know we're buying up important strategic ecosystems, lands, wildlife corridor lands at as rapid a clip as we can, and this is how the plan all fits together.
Right. So, generally speaking, the most sensitive areas, whether it's along the Santa Fe River or around Noonan's Lake or what have you, those are outside of the urban cluster boundary.
Few things that come up frequently. Why are all these trees being cut down? A new development comes in, and it looks like that land is being clear cut. Explain what's going on there.
Right, and I know sometimes it is very stark when you see a property that's been forested and those trees are removed. What I will say is Alachua County does have very stringent protections on any actual sensitive habitat. So if there's significant habitat or strategic ecosystem or listed species habitat, those are the first things that are required to be set aside, and really up to 25, in some cases 50%, depending on the type of habitat that's there. And in terms of our tree preservation, even when there's not, say, significant habitat, we very much want to keep the best canopy that's on the site from being removed.
But Jeff, I know that tree retention is important and that we do have safeguards in place.
It is very important. We have specific safeguards in place for heritage trees. For trees that are 60 inches and above, they're long-lived live oak type trees that are 60 inches and above. We have very stringent requirements, very difficult to remove those. For other canopy or other heritage trees that are on a site, we require retention from either 5% to 20% of the existing tree canopy on every site. To make sure that we're not clear cutting sites.
Also, I mean, you may see the area where, for example, a multifamily apartment complex is being built, but as that parcel came in, you were looking at the entire parcel, and what you don't see necessarily is what is being protected as part of that parcel.
That's correct. A lot of times you see areas cleared, but you're not understanding that the area you're not seeing cleared is part of that parcel. Additionally, it's really important that as development comes in and we recognize that there are property rights and that we want to have good and high quality development for things like affordable housing and to have commercial development that's within walking or biking distance of our homes, it's really important that we actually plant back a good urban forest. And that's another part of our land development code, is that we plant in a canopy back in place in the new development itself.
We're almost done, but another thing that I hear with some frequency is, why don't you just stop development for a while? Just put a moratorium on it and just stop it for a while.
And that's a good question. There are the ability to do moratoria in Florida for very short time periods and for very specific purposes. What I would say is that, as we recognized earlier, there are property rights that are associated with the designations we have in our comprehensive plan and our land development code and our zoning. And the state of Florida has very strong property rights protections. And so we can't stop development forever. I think the most important thing for folks to understand is that we want high quality development. We want development that meets the standards of our community, and development that will be a amenity ultimately to the community as it grows.
Remind people in general what citizens can do to be part of this process.
That's really critical, because every step of the planning process needs to be and reflect the community's values. So one thing, just with development, we have our Map Genius program, so it's mapgenius.alachuacounty.us. That has a lot of information on all kinds of projects. We have, related to that website is our development projects website, which shows when we have new developments coming in and what stage of the process they're in. We have a public comment website that's available to the public, that whenever you see a project coming in and you want to make a public comment or you want to be a party at the hearing, we have a website that's available for folks to go online. And of course, our phones are always available. Our staff is always available to answer questions, to take comments on any development, so that we can make sure that any comments that the public has on a development or a comprehensive plan amendment or what have you is offered to the decision makers, who are the Board of County Commissioners.
Great. Well, this is great information. It can be complicated, but thanks for making it a little simple for us. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.